Hi, Larry Elterman here, and today I want to talk about fuse taps for your automobile. And I don't want to talk about them just superficially. I want to go into great detail. I want to explain how they work on the outside, how they work on the inside, how they fit into your car, all the things that could go wrong, whether you need a fuse tap at all or not. I want to go into all the subjects in great detail so that you understand everything about it. I'm the kind of person, I don't like to just do something the way somebody tells me to do it without understanding. I like to understand it fully, so I'm going to pass this knowledge on to you. So why are fuse taps so confusing? Well, there's a lot of questions people ask about it that they get confused about. Like, for example, why does the orientation matter? And then people say, but it still works if you do it with bad orientation. And what happens if you install it with the wrong orientation? And if it still works with the wrong orientation, why does it matter if you install it with the wrong or right orientation? And some people say that if you install it wrongly, it offers no protection at all. And some people say that if you install it the wrong way, it still offers some protection, which is correct. And then why do you need a fuse tap at all? Lots of people install new circuits without a fuse tap. So I'll go into that. And why is there only one red wire coming out of a fuse tap? Don't you need two wires to complete a circuit? You need a red wire and a black wire or a ground wire. So why is there only one? And I want to ask this true or false question. One side of the fuse or fuse terminal on the fuse box is positive and the other side is negative. Is that true? I'll go into that later. And how exactly do fuse taps work on the inside? And how can you make sure you install it the correct way? I'm going to go into all these subjects. So I'm going to start with some peripheral subjects. I'm going to start with some general DC circuits with fuses and how an auto fuse box works, and I'm going to weave it all together and relate it to the fuse taps. But by starting with some general circuits, we can see how some of these things work, how the concepts are very simple without muddying the waters with exactly how it works in a car, which could confuse the situation. So let's dig in. Here is a very simple circuit. It has a DC battery powering one fan. There is no protection here, there is no fuse. Now I want you to notice something here. The red wire represents the positive side of the circuit, the black wire represents the negative side of the circuit. Notice that the positive side of the circuit goes all the way up to one side of the load, and then the other side of the load is considered the negative side of the circuit. This will come into play in some of the future slides that I'm going to show you. Now in a car, typically there is not a wire that goes all the way from the fan to the negative side of the battery. There could be if you wanted to, but that's not usually the way it works. The red wire usually does go from the battery to the load, the fan, and on the other side of the fan goes into ground, and all of ground, which is the car chassis, acts like a wire, and the DC part of the battery is plugged into ground, and so this whole part acts like a wire, and so you don't really need a wire leading back from the fan to the DC side of the battery. Okay, now I'm going to introduce one fuse into the circuit to protect the fan. And I want you to notice something about this circuit, that the red wire doesn't stop at the fuse. The red wire goes through the fuse and all the way to the fan. This is very confusing to a lot of people. They think one side of the fuse is positive and the other side is negative. But in fact, the fuse has no load at all. The fuse is just like a wire to offer protection, but there's no load that the fuse produces. And so the red wire, the positive side of the circuit, goes all the way to the fan, and only on the other side of the fan or the load is there a negative part of the circuit. You can talk about the hot side of the fuse, that side going directly to the battery, and you can talk about the load side of the fuse, but you cannot talk about the positive or the negative sides of the fuse. And this is very confusing because when people look at the socket of the receptacle in an auto fuse box, they see two terminals, and it's very natural to think that one of the terminals is positive and the other side is negative, when in fact one side does go to the battery and the other side goes to the load, but they're both part of the positive side of the circuit. So this is very confusing to a lot of people, and you have to make sure you understand that both parts of the fuse, all of the fuse, is part of the positive side of the circuit. Let's compare that to a cigarette lighter receptacle as an example. This really does have a positive and negative side. One side of this receptacle, the middle, is directly connected to the battery, to the positive, and the other side goes into ground. And there's no load in here. So if you were to plug, let's say, just a piece of metal in there, it would short out the whole thing and the fuse would blow. The load is what you plug into this. So that's very different than a fuse box. And in fact, if you do want a positive or negative without having to go through the fuse box, you can just plug it into this receptacle. But a lot of times that's very messy, and that's not what people want. But keep in mind, this does have a positive and negative, but the fuse box does not have a positive and a negative. Now, let's say we want to add an accessory to this circuit, in this case a dash cam to this circuit. How would we do it? Well, the first thing that we notice, just like in all the other parts, is that one side goes to ground. That makes it easier to install the dash cam. All we have to do is put one side of the dash cam to the ground. Now, in this picture, I have installed the dash cam so it'll work. The dash cam goes to the circuit before the fuse that protects the fan. In this case, the fan works perfectly well as it always did, and it's properly protected by the fuse. However, the dash cam completely circumvents the fuse, and there's no protection for the dash cam. If the dash cam were to short circuit, it could blow or short circuit any part of this wire. So the dash cam has no protection in this scenario. So this is a bad way to install the dash cam. Without installing another fuse, here's another way to install the dash cam. In this case, the wire goes after the fuse. This offers protection to both the fan and the dash cam. However, the current adds up. You have the current of the fan and the current of the dash cam flowing through the fuse. If either one of these short circuits, it's going to blow the fuse and the other will die. So if the fan short circuits, the dash cam will die, and vice versa. In addition, if the separate loads of the fan and the dash cam were to exceed the load of this fuse, it would blow the fuse. Now, most of the time that's not important because the fuse is usually rated way higher than the device it's powering. But if, for example, the fan were using up 3/4 of the capacity of the fuse and the dash cam were using up 3/4 of the capacity of the fuse, the total capacity would be 1.5, and the fuse would blow. So although this method is not too bad most of the time, and it will work, and a lot of times it will give you no trouble, it is still not as good as installing it correctly with a real fuse tap. And the other thing about this method is that it's physically difficult. What you have to do is you have to take this red wire and you have to wrap it around the blade of the fuse and then try to install the fuse with the wire wrapped around its base in such a way that you make sure that the wire is tight and doesn't fall off and that the fuse can still go into the receptacle. It can be done, but it's tricky. Now I want to introduce a new fuse so that both of these are protected. And here I introduced the new fuse, but unfortunately I did it in the wrong way. Why is that? Because the current of the fan and the current of the dash cam are still all going through this one fuse. So if either one of these blows, it will blow this fuse. And if the fan were to short circuit, it would blow this fuse and the dash cam would stop working. And in addition, you have the same problem as before, which is if the fan and the dash cam together exceed the rating of the fuse could blow. So again, this offers some reasonable protection, but it's not really the way you want to do it. And I want to point out that this diagram here is exactly the same as a fuse tap oriented in the wrong way. A wrong fuse tap orientation is equivalent to this picture here. So some people have said, I've seen on some of the videos where they say if you install a fuse tap the wrong way you get no protection. No, you still get protection. You get the equivalent of this protection right here, which 99% of the time will give you no problem. That's why people get confused. They install it the wrong way, but 99% of the time it doesn't matter. But if you really want to install it the right way, this is not the right way. So let's see what is the right way. So this is the right way to install the two fuses. You notice that there's a break in the wire before either of the fuses, so it turns it into two parallel circuits, each parallel circuit being powered by a separate fuse. So the fuse for this fan is totally independent from the fuse for this dash cam. And if the dash cam were to short circuit, it wouldn't affect the fan, and if the fan were to short circuit, it wouldn't affect the dash cam, and you're not adding the two currents together. The two currents are totally separate. So this is the correct way to install two fuses off one wire, and this is exactly the equivalent of a fuse tap oriented in the correct way, correct fuse tap orientation. And the only thing you have to worry about here is if the two items together exceed the original value of the original fuse, the current of the original fuse. Theoretically, you could damage this wire here because this wire may not be designed for the current of both devices. But in reality, that's really rarely the case because usually the peripheral that you're installing does not usually take up much current. So this is the correct way to do it. Now let's just try to tie it back to how it works with a fuse tap. So what does a fuse tap look like? Well, here's a picture, and that's fine, but it doesn't really explain anything, does it? You don't really see what's going inside. So in the next slides, I want to demonstrate what's going on inside the fuse tap. So here is a picture of the internals of a fuse tap, and let's see how this works. The fuse tap has a hot side, which is designated by this red, and the fuse tap has a load side, which is designated by this reddish brown. And when you look at the fuse tap, it will not have a label usually that says hot side and load side. It doesn't tell you. You have to know which side is which. But it's actually pretty easy to tell because the hot side is always the side away from the red wire, and the load side is always the side close to the red wire. So these are the blades that plug into the receptacles in the fuse box. Now if you look how this works, you plug the original fuse here. So how does that circuit work? The current comes in the hot side, goes through the original fuse, and goes back out the load side to the device, namely the fan in our example, and then the fan goes into ground. In addition, you have the split here, which goes around the original fuse, a parallel circuit, and goes through the accessory fuse, okay, into the red wire, which goes into your accessory, and the other side of your accessory goes into ground. So again, let's keep in mind the parts of this fuse tap and how you can know which is which. The fuse closest to the blades is always the original fuse. The fuse furthest from the blades are always the accessory fuses. And the blade away from the red wire is always the hot blade, and the blade close to the red wire is always the load side blade. If you're looking at this picture here, you can see that this would be the hot side, this blade here would be the hot side, this blade would be the load side, and this fuse here closest to the blades would be the original fuse, and this fuse here would be the accessory fuse. So now let's remind ourselves what the circuit looks like when it's improperly installed. The red wire goes after the fuse, so it's not really two parallel circuits. All the current is going through this one fuse. So that's the circuit improperly installed. And now let's look at the circuit with a fuse tap replacing all of this, and we'll see it's the same. So let's look at this wrong fuse tap orientation. The hot wire is supposed to be connected to the plus side of the battery, but we have it backwards. So what happens when we have it backwards? The current comes in from the positive side of the battery and goes into this terminal, this blade, and then goes through the original fuse, through this blade here, and then into this red wire and into the fan, which then goes to ground. No problem so far. But if you look how the accessory fuse gets its power, all the power is going through the original fuse, then around here and through the accessory fuse before it can get to the dash cam. So we have the current of the fan and the dash cam going through this original fuse. And if you look carefully and you compare it to the previous diagram, you'll see that they are exactly the same, and it's wrong. So here is the correct fuse tap orientation. The plus side goes in through the correct hot side of the fuse tap. It goes into here and then goes across the original fuse into the fan. And for the accessory, the current goes around this fuse and into the accessory fuse into the dash cam. And it's two parallel circuits, each powered separately by a separate fuse. The two fuses do not interact with each other. This is the equivalent of the correct drawing that I showed you previously. Okay, now that we've gone over how the fuse tap works in a theoretical sense, let's look at how we can install it correctly, make sure that we're installing it correctly. So that's what I'm going to go into now. The first thing is to identify all the parts of the fuse tap. So here's a typical fuse tap. Now notice that it has this red wire coming out. That's the hot wire that's going to go to your accessory, in our example to the dash cam. Now the blade, the fuse tap blade that's next to the red wire, nearest to the red wire, is always the load side blade. And the blade coming out of the fuse tap that's away from the red wire is always the hot side fuse tap blade. And the original fuse always goes closest to the fuse tap blades, and the accessory fuse always goes as far away as possible from the fuse tap blades. So it's important to understand the various parts of the fuse tap and exactly where they are. Okay, now that we've gone over the basics of the circuits and the fuse tap, it's time to figure out how to actually install our accessory. And the first thing you're going to have to do is establish a grounding point. You need a place to ground your accessory to. So this may not be as easy as you think, as most of these modern cars are covered in plastic and paint and vinyl, and it's kind of hard to find a place where you could easily tap into. So where do you find a place to tap your ground into? Well, one place is to use the cigarette lighter. The outer rim of the inside of the cigarette lighter is ground, and so you could plug in one of these adapters that you plug into the cigarette lighter, and you get a black wire and a red wire coming out of it. The black wire will be ground, and that could be your ground. But if you're going to do that, you might as well use the red side for your hot wire. And in fact, a lot of people do this, but the reason you don't want to do this is because it looks lousy. It's messy. That's why people don't usually or often don't want to use the cigarette lighter to power their accessory. So you want to find a different grounding point. Nevertheless, you will be able to use the cigarette lighter, and if you have one of these things, it makes it easier to test your ground later. So let's continue. How do we find our grounding point? So if you can't use the cigarette lighter, the next best thing is to try to attach it to the fuse box if the fuse box has a grounding screw. This one doesn't. Some do. If you have a grounding screw near the fuse box, that's good, but most don't. So most of the time you will not be able to ground your wire at the fuse box. If you don't have that, look for a bolt near the floor of your car that you can take off, a bolt that goes through the chassis. You can take the bolt off, and you can put one of these grounding wires. Here's a pre-bought grounding wire with a little hoop at the end, and you can put that over the screw and then bolt it down, and that should be a good ground. And if you can't find any of this, perhaps you could use a grounding clamp to clamp onto some piece of metal, and then your wire would go here to ground your wire to the clamp. And if you can't find any of that, then you're going to do your last option. Your last option is to drill a hole in the chassis. So you might, if these screws were in here, you might drill a little hole. You might drill a little hole right there, and then you're going to screw in one of these grounding taps, which are meant to go in a metal hole. You screw that in, and then you screw your grounding wire down. If you could use one of these that you can buy from a auto body store, auto parts store usually, that's good. If not, just use a plain wire. As long as it's not too thin, 16 gauge will do. So it's really important. I really suggest strongly that the first thing you do when you install your accessory is put the grounding wire in. It will make everything that you do easier after that. You'll have ways to test things as you go along if you have your grounding wire established. Now, one last thing that I forgot to mention is that once you have your grounding wire in place, you're going to want to have to test it. So the easiest way to test it is with a multimeter set to ohms. A multimeter set to ohms is the same as a continuity tester. And you're going to want to attach one end of your tester to the grounding wire that you just established, and you're going to touch the other end of your tester to the inside of the cigarette lighter, which is ground, the outside of the inside, this rim. And if you have continuity, that means that your ground is properly installed. Okay, now that we have a grounding wire, the next thing we want to figure out is which fuse slot we want to use, and then we will have to figure out which side of the fuse slot is hot and which side is the load side. So first we got to figure out which fuse slot we want to use. So we want to use a slot that currently has a fuse that has a big enough amperage. We don't want to use something like this 5 amp fuse. We want to use a fuse with a decent size amperage so we don't overload our circuit. But it's not as simple as just that. You also have to make sure that the fuse is not a fuse that powers something important like ABS brakes or ignition, because we don't want to interfere with some safety part of the car. And if we've gone that far, we also have to make sure that the fuse has power when we want it to have power. And so there's actually 3 cases there. The fuse might have power all the time, or it might only have power when the key is turned to accessory, or it might only have power when the full ignition is on. So you got to choose the right fuse, and so you got to narrow down all 3 things about choosing the right fuse. Doesn't interfere with something important, is the right amperage, and goes on when you want it to go on. And you'll have to test that, and you'll also have to test which is the hot and cold side, or the hot and load side of the fuse. So once you think you have, for example, a fuse slot that you think you can use like this one, and you want it to be on, for example, only when the accessory is on, you're going to turn the key to accessory. You're going to set your multimeter to volts. You're going to put one end to your ground, and then you're going to probe this fuse slot, and you're going to touch it here. And if it's the load side, you won't see any amperage, any voltage, recorded. If you touch it here and everything's working as it should, you will see a voltage. If you want it to be on only when the accessory is on, turn the key off. And if the power goes off, if the voltmeter shows there's no power, then you have what you want. If the voltmeter shows there is power, that means that this is a fuse that's on all the time. So there's all these things to think about, and you have to get the right fuse that you want for your accessory. And then once you've determined that, again, you use the voltmeter to determine which side is hot and which side is a load. And again, just to reiterate, you're going to touch one end of your voltmeter to ground, and then the other you're going to probe each side of the receptacle, and the side with the receptacle that shows a voltage is your hot side. The other is your load side. Okay, you now have all the information you need to install your accessory. So let's go over the steps. You're going to plug the original fuse into the original fuse slot in the fuse tap. You're going to plug the accessory fuse into the accessory fuse slot in the fuse tap. You're going to plug the hot side of the fuse tap into the hot side receptacle in the fuse box. Then you're going to connect the red wire from the fuse tap to the positive side of your accessory. And finally, you're going to connect the negative side of your accessory to the grounding wire. Now I want to make one point about dash cams, and possibly some other accessories as well, because I had this happen to me and it was very confusing at first. And that is that some dash cams come with 2 hot side wires, 2 positive wires, and 1 grounding wire. And you might wonder why that would be. Well, that's because the dash cam wants 2 kinds of powers. It wants one power that's on all the time so that it doesn't lose its settings and that it doesn't lose the clock. And it has another wire which it only wants to be on when the accessory comes on. So in that case, you're actually going to have 2 hot wires, and you're going to need 2 different fuse taps. And one of the fuse taps is going to go into a slot that's always on, and the other fuse tap is going to go into a slot that's only on when the key is turned to accessory. So I just wanted to make that point about dash cams because it confused me when I installed my dash cam. Well, that's about all I have to say. I think I've covered everything that I wanted to say. I really hope that if you spent all the time that this video took, I hope you gained something out of it and enjoyed it. Or if you didn't enjoy it, you at least got some information out of it. And that's about all I have to say. So this is Larry Elterman signing